Good afternoon, class. This is Doreen Akankunda. In our first lesson, I will be taking in poetry. We shall start with the definition of poetry, or when someone says poetry, what he or she means. We are going to see the meaning of poetry first. Poetry is a literary work. Poetry is a literary work that presents ideas in style and musicality manner. Poetry here, when I talk about it presenting ideas in musicality and style, this is what I mean. For the case of poetry, unlike other literary works like prose and drama, for the poetry, it presents work in style. This is what I mean. Poetry is full of figures of speech like metaphors, like irony, punning, onomatopoeia, and all that. So when I talk about poetry presenting ideas in style, that's what I mean. It's not like other normal literary work like prose or drama. No, that is not poetry. It also has musicality in it. When I talk about musicality in it, here we shall see rhyme, rhythm, repetition of words, and all that has music in it. That is what we call poem. Unlike other literary works, so poetry is somehow unique and different. This is what I can tell you. So today we shall focus on poetry and go deep see the aspects or features that makes up poetry. What really differentiates poetry from other literary works. That's what we are going to concentrate on today. So, first aspect or first feature of poetry is title. Title. This is our number one aspect or feature of poetry. When I talk about title is the same as heading. Or can I say that this is the heading of the passage, this is the heading of this is the heading of this. So even the poems have titles. But poems having titles is not compulsory. Not all of them that have titles. Some don't have, some have. So for the case of titles, it's like subject, or it's like subject matter. It's like it is ever precise and short, that shows what will be in the poem or in that text. For example, we have poems like I Love You, My Gentle One by Ralph Tamazere. It's Ugandan writer. I Love You, My Gentle One. It's the heading. I love you, my gentle one. So when you hear I love you, my gentle one as a title, of course, what you expect in the text or in the poem is love. Here, a writer is telling us about love. It has love. It has theme of love in it, and probably it's the subject matter in that poem. So for the case of title, it has to be short and precise. Most of them have short and precise. And please note this, I even said it earlier, not all poems have title. Not all poems have title. Some don't have, some have. So don't get confused on this. If we are to note something about the title, this is what I have for you. Please get your books, get ready, and we write something about title. Title in poems are the same as headings. That's point number one under title. Then point number two, some poems, no, I beg your pardon, point number two, most of titles are brief and precise. Most of titles are brief and precise. most of titles are brief and precise. For example, it can be the intruder, the stranger, the intruder, the stranger, my love. As I told you, most of these headings or titles are short and precise. Then another point, some of poems, I beg your pardon, some of poems do not have titles. Some of the poems do not have titles. Okay, this is all I can talk about title. We got another aspect called the speaker. Speaker as our number 2. When I talk about speaker in the poem, this is what I mean. Speaker in the poem is the person that we believe or that we imagine that is behind the poem, or is the someone who is talking. This speaker can use word I, can use words we, can use words us. So for the case of the speaker, that's how most of times we identify them in the poems. So speaker, in brief, speaker is someone talking in the poem. Most of poems, speakers are easily identified. Like what I told you above, I love you, my gentle one, in Ralph Bitamasire's poem, he says, I love you, my gentle one. My love is like fresh milk in Rubindi. Here, he uses I, my love, something like that. So here, it means that someone talking about that is the man telling the woman how he loves her. This is what I call the speaker. So let's write something about the speaker. The speaker is the voice behind the poem. Please note this down under the speaker. The speaker is the voice behind the poem. The speaker is the voice behind the poem. And then another point, the speaker, no, I beg your pardon, the person we imagine to be saying the thing out loud. The person we imagine to be saying the things out loud. Then another point, most of the speakers in the poems use pronouns like I, we, us. These pronouns like I, we, us. So that was all about the speaker. When we continue studying about the poetry, I will be bringing you poems and you identify me the speaker, you identify me the title that I've been telling you. Then another aspect is setting. Setting. When I talk about setting, setting is the same as the place, or actually it's where and when that very poem took place, or where or when something took place, really took place. For example, setting it can be historical. Here, when I talk about historical, I mean it can be set in post-colonial or colonial or before colonial era, or something like you will find there are poems which are talking about wars, which are talking about colonialism, which are talking about neo-colonialism, which are meet orders. That is what I mean for the poem to have a setting in historical era. Then another point I want to talk about is it can be time of the day. The poem can be set in the morning, it can be set in the evening, it can be set at night, depending on the speaker's choice. So what the writer wrote reading the poem. Then it can also be geographical area. It can be when I talk about setting, it can be geographical, it can be in swamp area, it can be in mountains, it can be in valley. So this is what I talk about setting. So in brief, setting is where the poem is set from. This could be physical or geographical, location or time. So let's write something about setting. Setting is where the poem is set from. Setting is where the poem is set from. Setting is where the poem is set from. Could be physical, geographical. Setting is where the poem is set from. Could be physical, geographical, location, or time. Hope you have wrote that. Setting can also be the time of the day, as we talked about it, like in the evening, in afternoon, at night, in the morning. So this is what I talked about also. I think that's all I can write about setting. Then when we talk about historical background, I said setting can also be set from historical background. For example, in post-colonial, in colonial, and before colonial era. Okay, I hope we are together. Then now another point is theme. Theme. For the case of the theme, this is underlying message that the writer or an artist wants to convey in the message. For the case of the theme, it is the idea. So when Ralph Tambazere is writing about love in his poem, I Love You, My Gentleman, today we'll use that as an example because it is easy for you people. So it means the main theme in the poem is love. He wants to express love to his lover. So for the case of the theme, it's the main idea or the main message in that very poem, what the real writer wants to convey or what he really wants to mean. This is the message and the idea in the poem. That is what we call theme. If you are talking about, if your poem is about suffering, like suffering of women in Africa, this is your theme. This is your theme. And for the case of the theme, it can be many. You can find a poem has theme, has love, has in one poem. So for the case of the theme, they are just the ideas in the poem. What the speaker really wants to convey in the poem. What is the speaker's message in the poem? It is what we call theme. I hope we are together. Let's write something down about the theme, please. Theme is the underlying message. It is the underlying message that the writer, it is the underlying message. Let me write for you the word underlying. It is the underlying message that the writer or an artist wants to convey. It can be love, it can be suffering, it can be all that. There are many things that the people can write about or the artist can write about in their poems. So for the case of the theme, we are done with it. We go for another point, which is character. Character. For the case of the character is the person or an animal or figure that is presented in the poem. A character can be the person playing this role. For example, in Ralph Tamasire's poem, I Love You, My Gentle One, you see the character when he's talking about how he loves the lady. So with the character we have the lady. So he talks about, he compares the love of her girl like fresh milk in Ravindi. So for the case of it, character can be a person, or it can be an animal, or it can be a figure. For example, in David Robaderi's poem African Thunderstorm, we shall see Rubadeli giving the traits of the person to the objects. For example, he said the pregnant wind. When I talk about the pregnant wind, it means he uses wind as the character. That is what I said, that even a figure, even a living thing can be given the traits of the character. So for the case of the character is any person or an animal that is presented in the poem. I gave you the example of David Rubadidis when he said in African Thunderstorm, the poem African Thunderstorm, when he said that the wind is pregnant. This sounds awkward and funny, but that is how poem operates. So for the character, it is the person or an animal presented in the poem. Let's write something down. As I told you, is any person, animal, or figure presented in a poem. Presented in a poem. Another point under character. Even a non-living thing can be given characters or traits. Can be given traits of human being. Can be given traits of human being. Here, for example, we should use David Rubadiri's African Thunderstorm. Then we go to another point called subject matter. Another aspect, subject matter. Another point here is subject matter. For the case of the subject matter, when I talk about subject matter, this is what I really mean. Subject matter is also an idea. It is also an idea or a message. So for the case of the subject matter, it is like theme, but somehow differs. For example, for the case of the subject matter, it is the main. A poem can be having many themes like suffering, love, restoration, but then the main idea that really present an artist wants you, the reader, to know, it is what we call subject matter. Or it's the idea that it's the main idea in the poem that the writer wants you readers to know, or it's his or her focus. I mean the artist, someone who wrote the poem, it is his main idea that the intended audience should read in the poem. This is what I really mean when I talk about subject matter. Please don't get confused. The subject matter, however much, looks like a theme, but somehow they differ. Because themes can be many in the poem, but then the subject matter is one, and that is the main idea that the real writer wants the intended audience to know. Then is the idea or thing that the poem concerns or presents. Is the idea or thing that the poem concerns or presents. Then another point we are writing above subject matter. Every poetry has messages. Every poetry has message to deliver. I beg your pardon. Every poem has message to deliver. Of course, in every message, there is in every poem, there is a message that the writer really wants the readers to know about. This is what I mean when I talk about subject matter. Then we go to another point called language and style. Language and style. When I talk about language and style, I said something about style when I was giving the definition of poem. When I was giving the definition of poetry, I talked about style. When I talk about style, this is what I mean. For the case of the poems, unlike other literary works like drama and prose, for the poem, it has unique diction. This is what I mean. It is full of speeches, and it is full of figures of speech. This is what I mean. Figures of speech, these are unusual words that the writers use for their poems to be nice, to look good. For example, these figures of speech, this is what I mean, like metaphors, which I say about metaphor, like panning, like an onomatopoeia, like repetition, and all that. So when I talk about language and style, this is what I mean for it, and most of poems have hard diction. I think you know that. For you people who like reading, poems have very very hard diction compared to the drama and novels. So this is what really differentiates it from other literary works. Please note something down. Language and poetry, pardon, language and poetry tended to be hard. Language in poetry tended to be hard compared to other literary works. Another point, it uses figures of speech. It uses figures of speech like metaphors, like irony. It uses figures of speech like metaphors, irony, metaphors, spelling metaphor, irony, puns. It uses figures of speech like metaphors, irony, and puns. And many other, there are many, the onomatopoeia, alterations, and all that, there are very many. Then we got another point called structure, another aspect, another feature of poem called structure. When I talk about structure, this is what I mean. Structure, most of times we know it as the shape of something, So for the case of the poems, it is not presented like drama or like prose. No, it is not in paragraph and it is not in the sentences. For the case of poems, they are in stanzas. You will find it has one stanza, two stanzas, three stanzas, four stanzas. And another thing, they are not in sentences. They are not presented in sentences. They are presented in lines. When we see prose, they are in paragraphs and sentences. But for the case of poem it is presented in stanzas and lines. That's what it means. That's what I'm talking about, the structure. The structure is the shape of something, or how something is built. So for the case of the poem, it is built in stanzas and lines. We shall all see that, like sonnet, 14 lines. We shall see all that. Let's write something about structure here. Poems, unlike other literary works, it has stanzas and lines. So when you're talking about poetry and then you say something like something like paragraph or sentence, my dear, that is wrong. It is built in stanzas and lines. So that is it. I think you noted that down. I said, unlike other literary works, poetry is made in stanza and short lines. Actually, you should note that they are short lines. They're not long. They're not long at all. They are short lines. Okay, and then we got our last aspect. This is not the last, but I just picked the most important for your stage to know the writer. The writer, the writer here is our last aspect or our last feature in poetry here. For the case of the writer, as it is a writer, it's someone who writes. So for the case of the writer in the poem, it is someone who has written that very poem. And for the case of it, writers tend to write their names down like this is our paper. Let's assume it's our poem. For the case of the writer, he writes here down the poem. So the writer is the person who writes the poem. The writer is the person who writes poem. The writer is the person who writes poem. I think you noted that down. The writers tend to write their names at the end of the poem. Writers tend to write their names at the end of the poem. As I told you, they tend to write it here. You find there Susan Chuguri, find there David Robadiri, you will find there so I use David Robadiri most of the times, but he's my favorite writer. Then we shall find there Ralph Bitamazire, many people there who wrote. I think that was our last aspect. If I'm to do the lesson review, I said poetry is a literary work that presents ideas in style and musicality manner. So we talked about that. Then we saw title as when we talked about it as a heading of the poem, or what really summarizes the poem. Then we talked about the speaker. We said it's the voice behind the poem. Then we talked about setting. I said setting can be geographical, historical, or it is the place where that the poem was set from. Then we talked about the theme, same way we said it's the underlying message. There can be many in the poem, like love, suffering, hatred, consolation, and all that. And then we talked about character. I said these are the person and animal figure presented in the poem. It's where I brought the idea, where I brought the example of an any living thing given the traits of a human being. Here we saw that in David Robadiri's African Thunderstorm, where he says the pregnant wind. Then we talked about subject matter. I said this is the main idea, the really main idea that the speaker or the writer wants to convey. Then we talked about language and style, where I said that for the poems, the language in the poem, it tends to be hard. It's a hard diction. It uses figures of speech and all that. Then we talked about structure, where I said that structure of the poem is not like prose. It is in stanza and lines. Then again I talked about writer when I say that the writer is the someone who writes the poem. That's all I had for you today, my dears. We shall meet next time in lesson 2. Please, when you are at home, I advise you to read to develop the culture reading. You read about the novels, you read about the plays, you read about the. But I always encourage my students to read about poem. I love poetry. Poetry is good, and you should not be misled. It is hard. No. It is the easiest. I'm telling you. So please read and stay safe. Always mask up and wash your hands. Nice time. See you.